Hello, I'm Rebecca Trout, Program Director of the All-America City Awards at the National Civic League. Today, Mike McGrath, Program Director of Research and Publications here at the National Civic League, will be interviewing Alan Curtis, President and CEO of the Eisenhower Foundation. Prior to his current position, Dr. Curtis served as Executive Director of President Jimmy Carter's Interagency Urban Policy Group and as Urban Policy Advisor to HUD Secretary Patricia Roberts Harris. Earlier, he served as a task force co-director on President Lyndon Johnson's National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence, formed after the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Dr. Curtis is here to discuss his work as co-editor of the Eisenhower Foundation's 50-year update of the Kerner Commission. The original commission responded to the urban protests of the 1960s and concluded that America was heading towards two societies, black and white, separate and unequal. The 2018 50-year update of the Commission concludes that the nation has made relatively little progress in reducing poverty, inequality, and racial injustice since 1968. The Ford Foundation now is providing support for dialogue on the priorities of the Kerner 50th, the need for evidence-based policy, and the creation of new will among the American people to carry out that policy. And with that, we'll get to our conversation. Mike?
Thank you, Rebecca. Dr. Curtis, you are the head of the Milton S. Eisenhower Foundation. Could you tell us just a little bit of what the organization does, and then we'll talk about the new publication and what you're doing with regard to the anniversary of the Kerner Report?
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Rebecca. And just congratulations to the National Civic League on all the work, the great work you've done on the Kerner Commission over the years. The Eisenhower Foundation was created as the private sector continuation of both the Kerner Commission, which issued its report in 1968, and the National Violence Commission, which released its report in 1969. What we do is update those two commissions over the years and also implement and replicate evidence-based strategies in communities of color, truly disadvantaged communities, especially work with high-risk children and youth, and with police. So we undertake policy, advocacy, programming, replication, and evaluation.
And the name of the updated report that you've put out recently is Healing Our Divided Society, Investing in America 50 Years After the Kerner Report. You edited it with Senator Fred Harris, who was, I think, our keynote speaker at the last year's All-America City Award.
Yes, I've viewed Senator Harris's presentation and have enjoyed over the years working with him, partnering on this. Fred Harris was our chairman for many years and is a dear friend.
Yeah. So let's, if you don't mind, let's do a little history here. The year is 1967. There's been a number of advances in the civil rights movement, mostly in the South, culminating in the civil rights legislation in 1964 and 1965. But 2 years later, there's sort of a transition going on within the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King has moved from the South to Chicago under the idea that racism wasn't just a problem in the South, but also in large urban areas in the North. The civil rights movement is sort of being splintered between different groups, and there's the Vietnam War going on. 1967, you have this outbreak of really horrendous civil unrest in several communities, particularly Detroit and Newark. Why do you think 1967 was the year that this kind of violence erupted?
Well, I think it was a buildup of America over many decades. And in a number of those cities where the protests were especially severe, there were issues with the police and certainly with the media. Many people, including President Johnson, thought that the protests were a result of outside organizations, Black Power organizations, for example, fermenting unrest. But the Kerner Commission, after a lot of reflection, concluded that essentially the protests, the initial protest evolved as a function of white racism, and then once this happened in some cities, the whole process snowballed. I think it's significant that the Kerner Commission, as Senator Harris always articulates, was composed mainly of privileged white men, members of the establishment, yet they reached these conclusions about how America was essentially not progressing towards two societies, black and white, separate and unequal, but already two societies, black and white, separate and unequal. So it's the American dilemma rather than outside agitators that led, from our point of view, Senator Harris's and my point of view, to the events in 1967. And of course, those events tended to be called riots by whites, but were called protests by people of color.
And in many cases, the proximate cause of these uprisings was police community relationships, police brutality, or police interactions that were experienced as unfair by those populations. Is that correct?
Sure, and then that just sensitized people, reminded them of everything else: intense school segregation, intense housing segregation, the fact that unemployment rates for African Americans have always been twice as high as for the rest of the population. So it's criminal justice issues, but it's also economic issues, and it's also education issues. It's also housing and neighborhood development issues.
The Secretary of Labor, Willard Wirtz, I was reading the introduction to your book, and he quoted Walt Kelly, the cartoonist who did the Pogo comic strip, saying, "We have met the enemy, and the enemy is us." What do you think he meant by that?
That we haven't faced the most obvious reality that America began as a nation that had slaves and had never really dealt with that fundamental American dilemma. As I have said, he meant that we should stop looking for excuses outside criminals, people who threatened our democracy, but he was saying we should embrace the basic fabric of America, realize what we are, and also recognize, I think, that as we went through the Second World War, for example, the American character has the potential for solving these solutions if we really face the realities.
And the commission report came out with a very detailed list of recommendations on policy issues on a variety of, different areas: economics, jobs, education, criminal justice, the community response, which was a separate chapter that we republished in our review last year, which I found really interesting. Maybe you could describe a little bit sort of the scope of these recommendations and how they were greeted by people in leadership positions.
Well, the recommendations led with economic policy and education policy, and with the fact that people of color were not given a fair opportunity for jobs, the most obvious one, and were not given a fair opportunity for education, equally obvious, and were often discriminated against by law enforcement. So it was a package of saying, look, these things have been around for a long time, and we're not facing them, and we need to. This was at a time when there was so much ferment, as you know, and we were dealing with the Vietnam War, among many other issues. And so when President Johnson heard of the report, he never really wanted to read it. He didn't accept it because he thought the report was getting in the way of his great society and taking away from the initial progress that the great society was making. So it was just an inconvenient truth at that point in time to the establishment. Yet the report, as you well know, was the best-selling federal report ever. I still have a copy of my $1.25 Bantam paperback of the Kerner Commission. A lot of Americans read this, and it kept alive. And again, kudos to the National Civic League for keeping it alive over all these decades.
Well, it's one of the most consequential commission reports ever published. I think, among many policymakers, the idea of when there's a problem, you put together a blue ribbon task force is kind of a joke. But this report actually had a pretty significant impact. And in fact, you say in the introduction to your book that for 10 years, there was substantial progress being made. Could you describe that?
Well, there were new initiatives like Head Start, like Job Corps that had promised. There was a new sense of hope with, for example, the momentum, the great momentum that was still going on in terms of asking what you could do for your country. So there was a reduction in unemployment among people of color. There was progress in terms of school integration, given that the Kerner Commission stressed economic and employment policy. Those were key indicators. There was at least talk of police reform. I don't know if it was really lasting, but the first 10 years did show some economic and education progress along the lines defined by the Kerner Commission in 1968.
And then what happened after that 10 years? Progress slowed. Why, do you think?
Well, we had Watergate, and Watergate in the early 70s was a message about government not working. We had later in the 70s issues of high inflation, for example, economic policy not quite working. And we had foreign policy issues like the Iran hostage crisis, which pulled America away from a focus on some of the Kerner priorities, and which led to Americans voting in an administration that said the problem was government. And that administration in the 80s proceeded to create policies, continue policies that were essentially the opposite of the Kerner Commission. So that in the 80s, unemployment rates for minorities increased significantly. The progress in school integration reversed. There was no real progress in terms of police reform, and we began a long-term trend towards mass incarceration, especially for people of color. So the shift was pretty dramatic over a period of about 10 years after the initial 10 years when there was some progress.
So between the early 70s and the 80s, there was a tremendous loss of confidence in public institutions, particularly in government and its agency, its ability to solve complex problems. And that led, you're saying, to a lack of support for policies that would have helped in some of these areas.
Yeah, and as part of what you just described eloquently, the naysayers were effective in communicating their message. And people who said things like, well, school integration works and youth of color are catching up, or there are more jobs now, or Head Start is really successful. Those people didn't frame their message as well as the naysayers did. And the legacy of the naysayers has continued to this day, and it's one of the most important realities we need to face if we're going to heal our divided society. But what we've done is begin with what you've just asked me about in our update, but we've gone on and said, okay, let's just take a step back. What is really happening here? What are the main themes that we need to embrace as we compare 68 to 2018 when we released our 50-year update? What can we learn with the notion that while America usually looks at change over quarters of a business cycle or year to year, we're looking at 50 years. Perhaps 50 years is a good period to really reflect on progress. And that's what we've been asking now around the country. We've issued our update, but the work has really just begun because we're now going out to the people asking what they think and not pontificating, but saying genuinely this has to be a bubble-up process if we're going to make any gains beyond what we had in 1968. So
you're actually, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So there are three themes, and we can discuss them in more detail if you want, that have emerged as important as we talk around the country. I mean, one of them is the basic trends. I mean, we've had our first African-American president. The African-American and Latinx middle classes have expanded greatly. The number of African-American and Latinx elected officials has expanded dramatically. So there are indicators of progress. Yet, if you compare 1968 to 2018, the overall child poverty rate has increased. The deep poverty rate has increased. Income inequality has increased. Wealth inequality has increased. Overall school segregation has increased. the number of people incarcerated was 200,000 in 1968. Today it's over 2 million, and they're disproportionately. As I talk about that around the country to audiences of people of color, they will say, of course, yes, we know that. Many white audiences do not know that or seem to be in denial. So the one theme is just the fact that we're not being realistic about the long-term trends. The second theme is that in response, we have very little evidence-based policy in terms of public policy at the local, state, and national level. Not enough programs, very few in fact, are evidence-based. Yet we do have some evidence about what does work. And what we need to do is acknowledge that, scale up what works and finance it by scaling down what doesn't work. Again, Americans aren't aware that we do have some evidence built up, and they're not really buying into the notion that, well, it makes common sense to scale up what works and scale down what doesn't. So we discussed that a lot in the different dialogues that we've had across the nation. And the third theme is simply that in order to scale up what works, we still need what the original Kerner Commission called new will. Back in '68, right after the Kerner Commission was issued, both Dr. King and Senator Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, endorsed the commission, and Dr. King was working on a new economic justice coalition that embraced all races and most classes. That was the beginning of some kind of process that could lead us to the generation of new will to scale up what works. But with their assassinations, all of that hope evaporated. So as we go around the country and begin to talk about, well, the first 10 years and then the second 10 years, we try to stop and say, okay, but let's now just compare '68 to 2018, and we got to be more clear and honest on the trends, on the need for evidence, and the need for new will.
So you took the book that you edited and took it to different communities and then discussed the findings and talked about what possible directions could be in the future. Is that correct?
We have done just that, and Senator Harris and I had a panel of distinguished Americans, from Marian Wright Edelman to Nobel laureate Joe Stiglitz, who write recommendations as part of a national advisory board, and then we combined all the recommendations. So it's a group effort. It's not quite a commission, but it's still a national advisory group of distinguished people. And Senator Harris and I have been talking around the country about what we as a collective enterprise found. And we've laid out some of what we found, but we really are encouraging people to listen and tell us what needs to be done, because we don't claim to have the answers, certainly in terms of new will especially.
And so some of the contributors to the book, or I guess part of this advisory group, would be Joseph Stiglitz, Diane Ravitch, Marian Wright Edelman, E.J. Dionne, Henry Cisneros, very prominent people. How did you select this group of people?
Well, we looked at the policy areas of the Kerner Commission. So economic policy led. So you want someone like the Nobel laureate in economics, makes pretty much sense. education policy was equally important. So we want educators like Diane Ravitch or Linda Darling-Hammond to be with us in terms of criminal justice reform. We had the former Assistant Attorney General for Justice Programs, who was co-director of the Task Force on 20th Century Policing. And we had people like Mark Maurer, who was has been for many years the director of the Sentencing Project, focusing on mass incarceration. So we went right down the line in terms of getting top people in each one of the policy content areas. And we also wanted people who could at least begin the discussion about New Will, like E.J. Dionne.
So where do you go from here, having done the book and then the tour around the country promoting the book? What's the next step here?
Well, we're continuing on through 2020 and 2021. So we'll be working to have an impact by conversations and dialogues and debates and disagreements and feedback from different populations. 2020 is obviously a key year in the history of our country and the future of our country. So we will build on what we've already done and keep modest and respectful of the people. And there are a lot of important realities to take into account when one decides what audiences to just make presentations to. So, for example, many people of color have told me, well, it's easy enough for you, Alan, to make a presentation to the NAACP or to the National Urban League. But you should be out there talking to the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce. You should be talking to the privileged white men who make the rules and frame the basic power equations. And you also ought to be directly addressing how we need good government. So that goes back to what was said in the 1980s about government being the problem. We are saying the problem is dishonest government and corporate greed. So we need to get more discussion of how, at some point in time, while much of good government now is local and you do that so well, we need to get back to good federal government. And President Lincoln freed the slaves. President Roosevelt created the New Deal and Social Security. President Obama created the Affordable Health Care Act. President Johnson created the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. So we have to deal with the issue of government being the instrument of change. And we need to say that beyond the great work that organizations like yours is doing, focusing on specific city governments, the entity, the reality, the big picture, if we're going to make progress on what the Kerner Commission said, it needs to also include federal policy. Not everything can be done locally, obviously. What works is demand-side Keynesian policy that creates living wages and health care for all workers, rather than trickle-down supply-side economics, which only enriches the rich. So government and its role is really important as we speak out. But we also are really impressed by what you have done year by year for so many years. And we would, I think, challenge the National Civic League to consider ways in which you can expand the All-American Cities Award. Can you do more cities? Can you take Kerner priorities, which you have advanced for so many years, and factor them into the criteria for any awards that you might make in any expanded programs? For example, can a city applying for an award demonstrate that it really has communicated the long-term trends in terms of employment and mass incarceration and education? Can the city demonstrate that it is really undertaking evidence-based policy and promoting efforts to further expand evidence-based policy? And is the city doing something that can increase civic engagement in the creation of new will? And how does that work in terms of specific nonprofit organizations? That is, we believe the nonprofit sector is part of the solution, and certainly your work focuses on not only the strength of city government, but the strength of indigenous nonprofit neighborhood organizations to advance new will and to encourage citizens on their own to, for example, strengthen American democracy by working on voting rights reform, voting on campaign finance reform, working on control and elimination of gerrymandering. So these are all kinds of things that we wanted to share with you during this discussion, because we think the National Civic League is part of the solution.
Well, thank you, Dr. Curtis. Those are great ideas, and of course, we have worked on those issues over the years. And but there's no, you can't give up. You have to keep pushing and trying to expand understanding of these issues and these programs that actually work. So, thanks for visiting with us, and thanks for doing the great work that you and the foundation are doing, and also your colleagues.
More power to all of you at the National Civic League, and we hope we can further engage you in the future.
Great.